Hey, and welcome to the very first episode of I Told You So. I'm Joseph. I am an attorney, and if you have clicked on this, as you already probably know, someone who has been quite vocal about my political viewpoints over the years. As many of you know, I made a promise that if Donald Trump were to win the 2024 election, I would start this podcast. Well, here we are. The election is over, and I am going to hold true to my word for as long as I can sustain this. And the plan is to kind of make this as malleable as possible in order to drive sustainability and ideally make it entertaining for anyone who wants to tune in. I intend on having guests on, like to host debates. I would like to make this as much of a platform for just kind of amplifying certain issues and having an open discussion about things that is within my own power. I do want to say that I'm not making this podcast to gloat or to be smug. Instead, my goal is to hold our leaders accountable and shed light on actions that will affect all of us. Each week, I want to dive deep into the policies, decisions, and statements coming out of the Trump administration. I want to analyze their impact, discuss the legal and ethical implications of such, and explore what these decisions mean for our future. In today's episode, I do want to drive home the point that while I'm obviously very engaged with politics in the sense that I'd like to think that I'm well read on these issues, and obviously graduating from law school, I think does give me a differing perspective than a lot of people. I implore everyone to read up these things for yourself. Don't just take my word for it. And ideally, if you have a disagreement with something I'm saying, I welcome that. If you want to talk at length about that, I'd love to have you on this platform. But at the end of the day, everything I'm saying here is simply just my opinion, obviously backed by facts and what I believe are sound reasoning, but like a lot of others, unlike a lot of others, rather, I don't think that my opinion can't be swayed if I am so wrong about something. But with that said, in today's episode, I want to just kind of do something preliminarily here and mainly use this as an opportunity to kind of test this format, make sure my equipment is all sounding and looking good, and laying the groundwork for what I intend to talk about going forward. So I want to discuss how factors like her campaign strategy, messaging, and voter perceptions played a role in the ultimate outcome of the election. And additionally, I do want to look ahead to what President Trump has already said he's planning to do and what that can mean for our country. But just before I dive in, I do want to thank anyone who is watching this right now, who has shown me a lick of support on social media, even just through a private message. Your engagement really means a lot to me. And if you feel that you're liking what you're seeing, feel free to like this video, subscribe, and do anything else on the platform that this may land on. Because, like I said, I'm very malleable at this point. With that, the question that I think a lot of people have been asking themselves the past few days is, why did Kamala lose? And just right off the bat, this is a complex issue, and people are not a monolith. The answer is always going to be a smattering of different things. You know, people can kind of give their perspective and say, oh, well, if she did this, she would have driven turnout exponentially. Or if she didn't say this, certain people would have stayed home to vote, or XYZ. And I think that you can look at any kind of decision on a sliding scale and say, If she did this, it would have brought certain people out, but at the same time, saying one thing could have led to someone else voting for Trump and vice versa. So I do think that there's always going to be an amalgamation of things. I think anyone kind of giving you the prescription that this is exactly what they needed to do to win, and because they didn't, she lost. I just think that that's kind of bullshit. But like I said, just my opinion. And again, I think a lot of this talk kind of hinges on the fact that people act rationally and know what the fuck they're talking about. I am uplifted by a lot of the conversations I have with people online and in person. But for every bit that I'm uplifted by those conversations, I'm equally dismayed at how certain people just really have no idea and oftentimes vote against their best interests. Now, I think one of the main things that we've been hearing about, Democrats have not played far enough to the left. Americans are stupid, racist, misogynist. And, I do think that is a partial answer to, like I said, I think that if people were less racist and misogynist, I'm sure more people would have voted for Harris. I think that if she went further to the left, especially on issues like Israel and Palestine, more people may have voted for her in the swing states, especially when it comes to Arabs in Michigan. However, I don't think that all of that is determinative. Now, again, I do think that politicians and talking heads like Bernie Sanders and AOC, Sam Cedar, Hassan Piker, they really only stand to benefit at this point by blaming the Democrats for not being left enough to push them further to their own side. So I wouldn't necessarily take what they're saying as the most reliable, despite some of them making several good points. But again, I think it rings true that the electorate isn't a monolith. Now, a big statement that had some buzz going into the later end of the week, Bernie Sanders kind of blasted the Democratic Party, saying it should come as no great surprise that the Democratic Party, which has abandoned working class people, would find that the working class has abandoned them. First, it was a white working class, and now it is Latino and black workers as well. While the Democratic leadership defends the status quo, the American people are angry and want change. And they're right. Today, despite strong opposition from a majority of Americans, we continue to spend billions funding the extremist Netanyahu government's all-out war against the Palestinian people, which has led to the horrific humanitarian disaster of mass malnutrition and the starvation of thousands of children. Will the big money interests and well-paid consultants who control the Democratic Party learn any real lessons from this disastrous campaign? Will they understand the pain and political alienation that tens of millions are experiencing? Do they have any ideas as to how we can take on the increasingly powerful oligarchy, which has so much economic and political power? Probably not. Very serious discussions are now merited about the path forward for those of us concerned about grassroots democracy and economic justice. Stay tuned. That, I think, is a visceral message from Sanders, essentially giving his own prescription, in that the Democrats did not offer the populist messaging that was required to stop someone like Donald Trump, who may not necessarily be populistic in many of his policies, beyond some of the kind of protectionist taxes and tariffs that he wants to kind of use to bring back American manufacturing jobs to kind of produce some of these more base materials. I think when we look at the messaging from the Harris campaign, it was very clear that she was running on the kind of intangibles, right? She wasn't necessarily providing a policy prescription for driving down the cost of inflation. for putting more money in Americans' wallets. And I think this is kind of what Sanders is talking about here, where Donald Trump was obviously, as he was running against the incumbent, essentially, and kind of obviously wanted to hammer home the fact that there are still problems that Americans across the country are suffering, especially in terms of economics. And while he may not have a real strategy to kind of alleviate those issues, just acknowledging that they were there and that there is a problem present, I think was enough to kind of sway people to believe that if he's going to acknowledge a problem, he may want to also solve it as well. And while Harris did, in a wishy-washy way, recognize that inflation was higher than it should be, she wanted to tout all of these intangibles of the Biden administration in lowering things like inflation, in increasing real wages, in lowering the unemployment rate. However, these, while in the past 20 years or so have always been positive talking points for the economy, they're not always things that are felt outright in the wallets and hearts and minds of the average American. Again, how much of this strategy would have actually benefited Harris in a way that would have swung her the election? I do think that there are certain things that she could have said that probably would have driven home the point that she acknowledges that there are problems. She can commend the Biden administration for improving on things like inflation, but also really drive down some hardline policies that are meant to go directly in the hands of the people as opposed to benefiting the top 1%. And I do think that that is something that he's correct on. Bernie Sanders is correct on. He is consistently touting the fact that millionaires and billionaires should not be able to buy elections. And with Supreme Court decisions like Citizens United, allowing essentially unchecked dark and gray money into the political sphere, it's clear that that's something that's still happening, and it's a problem that does need to be remedied. And now with Donald Trump having the world's richest man essentially in his pocket, or the opposite, I think time will tell on that, there are major concerns there. But the thing is that Elon Musk, we can talk negatively about him all we want, but it's not like the Democrats also don't have their own millionaires and billionaires that are lining their pockets. If you look at how much money was actually flowing into these campaigns, $1.9 billion in this election was just spent by 150 families. And I think that when there are 150 families that have a completely outsized relationship with the politicians that we're electing to federal office, there becomes a huge problem of accountability there. But bringing it back to Harris's messaging in her campaign, how can you drive home that sense of authenticity when most of your campaign funds are coming from people who are not living the lives of the 85 million people you're asking to turn out to vote for you? That's a problem. And I think Cenk Uygur said he came out with a video the day after the election that I do think was not something that I agreed with 100%, but I do think he hit the nail on the head at a lot of different points. He said that Harris should have embraced a strategy involving the legislation while she's currently in office. And I don't necessarily think that that's the wrong idea.
So if Kamala Harris, this was the plan that I wanted to get to Tim Walz, but I'm not connected enough, I'm not rich enough, I didn't donate enough, so I couldn't get to Tim Walz. What I wanted to say to them is, try to pass paid family leave in the middle of the election. Again, they would have been like,
Be civil, don't do anything.
Play prevent defense. Who the hell told you you were winning? Why are you playing prevent defense? Because if you try to pass paid family leave in the middle of the race, okay, I get it, that's unconventional, right? Well, what would have happened? You put the Republicans in a super tough spot because they got to either sell out their corporate donors or they got to sell out the average American. 84% of Americans want paid family leave.
He goes on to cite paid family leave as a populist, progressive idea that she could have urged Biden to push, and the Republicans would have been at fault for not passing a bill such as that. When you have a large majority of people who support that policy, a lot of the criticism, I personally, and I know that this is anecdotal, but a lot of the criticism I heard towards Harris is that why would she run on these things and then not try and do them right now? Why do we have to wait for the solutions? And while I was in my, do nothing but defend Harris stage, there's clearly merit to the argument that the VP is an essentially powerless position in terms of their own formal duties. But we do have to take a kind of look outside of that and look at the reality of the situation. And we can't try and think about an alternate timeline where if Biden were brought into the fold and they wanted to dampen this argument immediately, this is something that Trump was saying, especially at the debates over and over again. If they wanted to get rid of this argument, have the administration push key legislation that has bipartisan support and naturally could have served to benefit them. And if that were to be done, the criticism that Harris should have distinguished herself from the Biden administration would have gone less far, because she would have had something tangible in real time that she could cling to as something the Biden administration is doing. So, people can kind of complain about their gripes with the Biden administration, and people's wallets are still hurting, and she's running on all of these things that she plans to do. But why not live in a world where you don't actually need to distance yourself from Joe Biden? Again, most people don't focus on presidential elections outside of the final weeks, and even that is stretching it. So touting things like the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, they're not going to serve well to benefit her when Americans suffer from short-term memory loss. And not to mention that the positive effects of these bills are kind of only bubbling under the surface right now. They were mainly designed for long-term economic gains, and with many Americans struggling right now, it's not, and in a perfect world, again, like that would be great, but should people be expected to always see the bigger picture beyond what's happening in their situation right now, especially if they're struggling to put food on the table for their kids or struggling to afford health care? Again, it's one thing to say unemployment is down and the stock market has never been higher and we're producing more oil than ever before. So you should be grateful when, again, people have a real issue with this economy, and it's something that's happening worldwide, which I'll definitely get to that in a little bit. But if the moment is as big as they were saying, why would the administration not be pushing Congress more to put their agenda on the forefront? And I think that there was kind of a hybrid approach to this that the Harris administration was doing on the topic of immigration. And it's already at that point something that the Democrats had lost a ton of credibility on. While throughout Biden's whole term in office, they have spent this time gaslighting people into thinking there were no issues with the asylum process as it stands. And rather than tackling the issue head on in a small way, providing the states the resources they needed to house people, to process these claims quicker, the work only started getting done in the election cycle. And while the claim is true that Trump told Congress or Republicans in Congress rather, to kill the border bill that could have passed and most certainly was not perfect. Whether, the arguments that it was too harsh or too lenient, I think both sides have some standing there. But again, it was better than nothing. And in an attempt to play politics, Trump told Congress people to kill the bill. And that's terrible. But then again, we can't shy away from the fact that the Democrats also played politics on this issue as well through their gaslighting throughout the Biden administration. Except the results as they stand in this election show that regardless of how detestable his policy prescriptions were, his rhetoric was, it ended up resonating with enough people to where it was worth it. Because exit polls showed that voters concerned trusted Trump on immigration more than Harris. And policy doesn't make me as a reasonable individual think that that should be the case. But it's not always about reasonability, and it's about perception. And on the other side of the coin, moderates within the Democratic Party suggest that Harris's defeat may be linked to perceptions of excessive alignment with leftist interest groups. They often touted her as the most left-leaning person in Congress when she was a senator. That the party's failure to appeal to swing voters and address economic concerns in a straightforward manner contributed to her loss than any lack of progressive policies. It's just about articulating these moderate positions that she tried to put forth. Polls showed that 44% of voters viewed Harris as too liberal, compared to only 34% who saw Trump as too conservative. So you had a lot of low-info voters coming to the polls with the idea that Trump was the more moderate than Harris. And I think that that's not something that could be ignored either, because if you've lost these moderates and you've lost these leftists as well and these progressives, then there was a clear and fundamental problem with the messaging that was being conveyed. It was mixed messaging. Most of her policy prescriptions were canned phrases, again, hammering home her $25,000 first-time home buyer credit. And at the outset, she had a plan to counter price gouging on groceries. And it seemed to be doing well for her. She had a pretty sizable lead in the polls, but once she announced that, Donald Trump was calling her a communist. And once those accusations were levied at her, that policy, I don't necessarily think she dropped it outright, but it's not something that she had been touting over and over again, especially on national media. And again, she was obviously more in the weeds on economic policy than Donald Trump had been during the election, emphasized by, his clear inability to articulate really anything sensible, like when he was trying to talk about childcare.
And if so, what specific piece of legislation will you advance?
Well, I would do that, and we're sitting down. I was somebody, we had Senator Marco Rubio, and my daughter Ivanka was so impactful on that issue. It's a very important issue, but I think when you talk about the kind of numbers that I'm talking about, that, because look, childcare is childcare. There's something, you have to have it. In this country, you have to have it. But when you talk about those numbers compared to the kind of numbers that I'm talking about by taxing foreign nations at levels that they're not used to, but they'll get used to it very quickly. And it's not going to stop them from doing business with us, but they'll have a very substantial tax when they send product into our country.
Kamala also had to do the legwork of introducing herself to people. The Biden administration seemingly hid Harris throughout her entire tenure as vice president. And, we can speculate as to why that was the case as much as we like, But at the end of the day, I don't think people at the end of Biden's term, especially if he were to have not dropped out, would have really any clear idea about who Kamala Harris was as a candidate, as someone who governs, or as a person, really. People, they know Donald Trump. And many people not tuned into politics still see him as a straight shooter. And because he essentially calls out solutions to problems that plague this country, or the perception of problems that plague this country. While obviously many of that straight shooting is racist and sexist, it does seem that there were a chunk of groups of people of color and women that were not at all fazed by it. Now, when you compare that to Kamala Harris, who throughout her tenure in the campaign was mostly doing rehearsed stump speeches, brief interviews where if she's prodded, again, she's giving these canned answers, or directed the attention to her misgivings with Donald Trump. And I don't think that the overall strategy of highlighting Donald Trump's danger to democracy, his overall failures, and his own previous surrogates comparing him to Hitler and calling him a fascist were dumb moves. She forgot to pair that with a way to humanize herself. And that's something that Donald Trump was seemingly able to do for half of the electorate. Charlemagne the God, he called out Harris a few weeks ago on this, and he said, "Oh, you're really rehearsed." I forgot exactly what he said, but he essentially called what she was saying rehearsed, and kind of levied these complaints that, or insults that Trump and his affiliates had levied at her, and she labeled that contrast. And again, like this was an opportunity for her to kind of speak candidly and really say something biting. But instead, she just labeled that contrast as discipline, shrugged it off, and then moved on to the next thing. And the thing is that arguably the best moment of her, despite her entry into the race, because people were eager for a fresh face, it was the debate. And of course, many of her lines were rehearsed and scripted there as well, but a lot of the positive commentary that I had seen arose from her quick-wittedness and her ability to think on her feet and counter Trump directly. And paired with the looks of shock and disdain that she had for Trump while he was saying some of the batshit crazy things that he was saying, I mean, those things were like memed out of proportion. And like memeability, I don't think is something that could be disregarded in at least our presidential elections anymore. But the thing about memes is that they need to come naturally through those kind of candid moments, those unscripted moments that happened at the debate where she was just kind of fucking mopping the floor with him. And memes don't come through force feeding them through Instagram accounts like Kamala HQ. It just doesn't work, and it just doesn't generate the attention. And ultimately, again, it just kind of gives into that notion that everything that's going on is planned. There's a way to kind of do things that are planned, but still do them in a way that clearly conveys your message. I mean, look at AOC. Look at Bernie Sanders. Outside of their policy prescriptions, they are fantastic at communicating their message. AOC frequently does Instagram Lives. Bernie appeared on the Lex Fridman podcast just a few weeks ago, and he's been on Joe Rogan before. And Bernie, to this day, is someone who Rogan says that he supports vehemently. And despite his endorsement of Trump, he's always been positive, spoken vocally about his support for Bernie Sanders. Coming at, again, against the argument that she should have been running a more progressive campaign, it's not like most of the attacks from the Trump camp were painting Harris as too moderate or too conservative. They were describing her as a Marxist, communist, and socialist, and everything in between. She 100% tried touting. She 100% just tried towing this middle line far too much. It confused people, and it didn't do her much good, clearly, because I think the very fact that we're talking about this is whether she ran too far left, whether she ran too far to the middle. There is clearly and people are going to give you answers and give you things to back those up. But the very fact that it's even an argument just shows that there was a confused message in her campaign. Another facet of all of this is beyond the whole running too far to the left or running to the middle and appealing to certain bases and not to others. I think people are just deeply misguided on how the economy works, beyond how they feel themselves. Most people, again, are only tuning in the final few days. I don't have to coddle anyone. I'm not a politician, so I'm not here to tell people that their viewpoints are valid when they're not based in objective data. Real wages are higher, inflation is getting better, and people are feeling the economic weight on their shoulders worldwide. It's not something that was caused by the Biden administration. People, I think, going to either extreme of this issue as to, oh, you shouldn't shame people for how they think about the economy when they're really struggling, versus, well, Biden's actually fixing things, and all of your emotions are not valid. I think the real answer here is kind of somewhere in the middle. Again, real wages have been rising. Wage growth in the U.S. was 6.3% in August 2024, while inflation had cooled to around 2.4% in September. People's personal financial situations often lagged behind economic reality. There's rising rent, rising healthcare costs, food prices have skyrocketed, but these don't necessarily reflect broader economic trends. We are a deeply polarized nation, and because of that, people gravitate toward extreme narratives about the economy. They love to blame Biden for their situation since he's the guy in office. He's the guy pulling the strings. And despite the nuance that inflation was largely driven by global factors, and the U.S. was doing much better than other countries concerning inflation and other economic plights, Biden had little control over the supply chains that disruptions that COVID had caused. He had little control over Russia invading Ukraine. But when you're in office, people want someone to blame, no matter how much you kind of chip away at the problems at hand. And this isn't just a Biden and Harris issue. Incumbent parties across the globe suffered widespread voter backlash. In England, they shifted back to the left because when you're in charge, it's very, very hard to run from high inflation, high cost of living, and an immigration problem that one side wants to gaslight you is not an issue, and the other side wants to completely eliminate anyone coming into the country. I don't think it's revolutionary to say that like both sides are probably wrong. Another thing that people love to talk about, Harris should not have hammered home the messaging that Donald Trump is a fascist, and I think that's stupid. When Trump's own people, former Chief of Staff John Kelly, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Mark Milley, had publicly warned that Trump displayed authoritarian tendencies, Kelly stating that Trump fit the general definition of a fascist due to his admiration for dictators and his desire to use the American military against citizens. I mean, as a politician, I don't think that this is something that you could shy away from. I think it would have been silly for her to not play this up. I mean, given Trump's actions leading up to this election, his attempt to overturn the 2020 election results, his admiration for autocratic leaders, his call for mass deportations and political retribution of his opponents, these warnings from Harris were not baseless. Nearly half of Americans view Trump as a fascist themselves. Like I've said, voters are not monolithic, and while some were primarily concerned with economic issues like inflation, others were deeply and rightfully concerned about the future of American democracy. Harris had to strike a balance between addressing these concerns, and she failed. She could have framed Trump's authoritarianism as not only a political threat, but an economic one as well. She could have highlighted how autocratic regimes throughout the world and throughout history have often led to economic instability and corruption. This notion that she shouldn't have touted the Cheney endorsement, again, I think that that's a bad idea too. You want a broad coalition, but at the same time parading her around like she's Mao Zedong was probably not the right move at all. It didn't move the needle in swing states like Michigan and Pennsylvania. And truthfully, I think it only served to drive a wedge between her and Arab American voters, given the fact that Cheney and her father are war hawks. There's no other way to paint that. You pair that with the already frustrated pro-Palestinian wing of the Democratic Party, feeling disenfranchised by thinking that the Biden administration has not done enough to curb Netanyahu's genocide, and you have a recipe for disaster. I think that ultimately there was a way to toe a middle line. There was 100% a way to toe a middle line by saying that Trump is a fascist or fascist adjacent, if that's more palatable to you. And we have people on the other side who agree with this, and this is all that we agree on, and that's the extent of our agreement. But I don't think, I think that it just gave them way too much fodder to work with when they have Cheney out there speaking on Harris's behalf in swing states. In the social media age, I mean, did anyone actually listen to Liz Cheney's speech? I'm sure as fuck did not. And I would only assume that that's pretty much probably what she had stuck to, was the overall messaging behind her fears about Donald Trump, but the average voter is just scrolling through their feed and they see a picture of the two together, and it just paints this image of an establishment in which Liz Cheney and Dick Cheney were a part of for many years, and Harris aligning herself with them. But in this veil, it wasn't the Democratic Party establishment, which could have been worse for her also, but it was the Republican Party establishment. And when the Republican Party doesn't even like their own establishment, and you've been feeding a message to Democrats and the American electorate at large that people like Mitt Romney, Liz Cheney, Tim Ryan, Paul Ryan, Marco Rubio, these are guys that are dangerous and are only looking to serve the interests of millionaires and billionaires. Why would you parade these same people around like now they're God's fucking gift to earth, and because they support you, everyone should support you? And lastly, I think the biggest issue of her campaign was just the fact that it was very low risk and, quite frankly, low reward. And she got exactly what she put the wager on. The campaign was so overly cautious. As I've said before, they relied on these canned stump speeches rather than in swing states, mind you. And I understand that stump speeches are a thing that is often done by campaigns to great success. But when you're running against a guy who does also give stump speeches, but they're often unrehearsed and rambling into nowhere, despite the fact that what he's saying is nonsensical, still creates this aura of authenticity around him to people who are not completely tuned in. And when you're saying the same exact thing over and over again for 100 days, what are people supposed to think? I mean, there came a point where I was tuning into all of Harris's speeches to see what she was saying, and it was rarely very different from the last each forthcoming speech. And that's a problem, because we don't live in an era where people from Pennsylvania can't see the speeches coming from Michigan and vice versa. I mean, I'm in New York and I'm watching all of these speeches, and someone in fucking India can also watch these speeches, and they're seeing the same exact thing every day for weeks on end, and the message doesn't change. And there's nothing dynamic about it. It doesn't seem like there's ideas being presented. It doesn't seem like she's thinking about these things in real time, and that is something that I think the campaign is really needing to deal with now. When you're running against a guy who thrives in these off-the-cuff, unpredictable settings, you can't run a campaign like this. And that's even the most frustrating part, is the most off-the-cuff and unpredictable setting of the entire campaign. The debate was Harris's biggest moment of the entire thing, and she absolutely crushed him, because it doesn't take much to be quicker on your feet than Trump. It doesn't take much. And instead of capitalizing on that and seeing how much benefit, that positive media benefit that she earned from doing so well in the debate, it may not have translated wholly directly to the polls and given her as much of a bump as she would have liked. She totally could have capitalized on that appearance that she had given herself in the debate. But instead, she and her constituents in her campaign only seemed to focus on avoiding mistakes rather than taking risks that not only could have energized her base, but swayed undecided voters as well. She refused to go on Joe Rogan, and when I say that, she refused to do his show in a way that he has his show, he has his format, he has the location that it's in, and she looked to change that entire thing. Regardless of how you feel about him, it's the largest podcast in the United States with a massive audience of young men that she lost, and there's no reason she should have, because she needed these people, but she didn't speak to them. It's a demographic that Trump led by a significant margin, and even if she were to eat into that slightly, she probably could have eked out a victory. And I think through going on his podcast in a long form setting in his studio that is iconic to so many of his viewers, and talking to him one-on-one like a human, because Joe Rogan admittedly is an idiot, and if they were just kind of talking like two human beings, I mean, there's no question that Harris is more lucid than Trump, and clearly more down to earth than him. She seems like a cool lady. Like there's no reason why, especially if you contrasted her appearance or her would have been appearance with Trump's, I think it would have been night and day, and a lot of people would have been like, "Oh wow, this is like just like kind of my aunt," and they would have probably maybe came out for her. But instead, she she didn't outright refuse. She just said, I'm only giving you an hour, and you have to travel to me. And I think that only served to reinforce the perspective that she was unwilling to engage in more spontaneous and challenging environments. And it only served to solidify her image as overly scripted and risk-averse. And the craziest part is that people were going to bat for Harris on this when this happened. And they said, Joe Rogan, you have the audacity. You have the audacity to tell the vice president who's running a busy campaign that she has to come to your studio to do your show? And it's like, yeah, hell fucking yeah, because he's the one with the audience. He doesn't stand to gain at all. What is he going to gain? A few... I don't know how podcast revenue works in Joe Rogan's lane, but a few $100,000 of tens of thousands of dollars, whatever the fuck it was, is her currency that she's trading in is votes, and those are priceless. And what did she do later in the week? She went on SNL for a 5-minute fucking thing that gained no traction. It's like all of that time that she had spent doing these, she could have cut out a half of a day of doing fucking the same speech that she did 4 weeks in a row in Michigan. If she traveled to Texas and took half a day to do that podcast, I'm not saying that this would have absolutely netted her victory, but I would only think that it would have closed the gap. And if they made decisions like this, spanning all of these weeks that put her in high-risk, high-reward environments, I think that she would have succeeded. And for some reason, they treated her like Joe Biden. They treated her like someone that just could not communicate her message. And from what I've seen from her, I don't necessarily think that is who she was, in the sense that she couldn't communicate her message. And then when it comes to Tim Walz, they seemingly had him doing more media appearances before he was picked as vice president than afterwards, once he started getting what should have been expected media scrutiny over his previous gaffes. This is something that you have research done into weeks prior. It's like him stretching the truth about carrying weapons in war and all of the shit with his time in China. It's like this should have been stuff that they knew about, that they had planned responses for in advance. And it was like, get this fucking guy on Fox News, get this guy on all of these platforms talking in the way that he was when he was picked. I mean, people were energized behind him. The whole weird thing was sticking pretty well, and then all of a sudden he just dropped off the face of the earth, and again was just doing these canned speeches, and no one here was galvanized by a speech that Tim Walz did. It was these short little bursts of energy that he was showing in hostile-ish environments that I think what drove people to think that he was a good pick in the first place, beyond the obvious reasons why people liked him for policy concerns, for his work in Minnesota. But I didn't know what was going on in the Minnesota political sphere 3 months ago, 4 months ago. It's just absolutely frustrating to me. I don't know. She came off polished. She came off evasive. She would give non-answers or deflect when she was asked direct questions. And I think people understand when they're speaking to a politician or hearing a politician speak. And she spoke like a true politician, and she can call that as disciplined as she'd like. But it made it difficult for voters to feel like they were getting honest or clear responses from her. And in contrast with Harris, Trump's obfuscation of the issues and his rambling was seemingly more effective because it was wrapped in blunt, populist rhetoric that a lot of voters found relatable. And she clearly struggled, just as he did, when faced with more nuanced policy discussions or when pressed for details about her own records or plan, saying that she would ban fracking a few years ago, and now she doesn't. And I think that there are clear answers that she could have given to this, where it's like, if she wants to defend her record as senator, it's like I was voted in to represent the interests of the one of the most, if not most, liberal state in the country, and I represented those ideas for the people of California. Running a Democratic primary, I mean, she could have given reasons as to why she ran to the left there, and really kind of showed what she had seen from voters in Pennsylvania that made her change her mind. But it wasn't necessarily acknowledging that she had kind of flip-flopped on these things, but again, a gaslighting as to not really giving a real answer. And during interviews and town halls, she would often just kind of pivot back to criticizing Trump rather than providing substantive answers based on how she would address these key issues like inflation or healthcare. So ultimately, I know that I went on for quite a bit as to why I think that she lost, and I think everything I said was a little piece of it. And, there's a lot of ripping into her and her campaign, but the end of the day, what this election has made clear is it's not always about who has the better plans, who has the most effective plan, who can tell you, that they have something to address for every issue that people may care about. It's about how you're conveying your message, how you're conveying those plans. And the proof is in the pudding. She just did not do it correctly. Because if she did, we wouldn't be in the situation that we're in now. I think that it's very obvious that as a woman of color, there were hurdles that she had to clear that a white man would not have to. Or, I mean, in terms of intersectionalism, that being a woman of color does not bode well for her in that sense. But I truthfully do think that if you took a white man, a straight white man, and put just kind of like a little puzzle piece, just kind of flipped the two of them, I think the same exact result would have happened, because the authenticity really, really matters. And there was just this inauthentic sense that was coming from her campaign that she wasn't able to shake. Whether you like Biden or not, he certainly comes off as a genuine individual. I mean, he's known for really kind of connecting with people on a personal level, and he wears his grief concerning his son, both of his sons, his wife, his ex-wife, on his sleeve. And I think that's something that people look at and they see a human with empathy. And not that I don't think that isn't Harris. I just don't think that she did a great job conveying that. I mean, last night I saw a picture of her playing with her Connect 4 with her nieces on the floor, and she's wearing pajamas. after she took the L, and it's like, where the fuck was this picture 3 weeks ago? Where were things like this that were like, oh, like this is just a person, and they seemed to forget that at the heart of any campaign is a human, and it's not just a brand that you're selling to people. And it's sad because Trump is kind of the inverse of that, where Trump is the brand, but the brand is this unfettered realness. And say what you want, I mean, the dude tried to coup the government, and he still managed to get almost 70 million votes. I haven't checked in a few days, but I would assume probably more at that point. So just something to ponder as we go forward. So it is approximately 10 o'clock at night, and I've just finished doing all of the edits to what you've just watched. And as I was editing it, I couldn't help but realize I forgot to talk about the most important thing. And it's because I don't have notes here about it, because I thought it was just so obvious that I would have mentioned this anyway. But the biggest thing, beyond all of the shit I just talked about, Harris and her campaign, the biggest fucking issue with this is that Joe Biden had decided to run for re-election in the first place. If that man just held true to his promise that he was going to be a transitional president, and he literally picked Harris for the express reason of picking someone younger who he could eventually pass the torch to, which he did in a sense, but he didn't do it in the way that people kind of voted for him, with the pretense that he was going to be a one-term president. And because he decided to essentially be selfish, keep his power for himself, and lie to himself and the American people that he was well suited to be in office for another 4 years, and robbed the Democrats of the opportunity to host a full primary, to rob Harris potentially of succeeding in that primary. That was the absolute biggest problem. Not that everything I said before, I do think holds true. I think that if certain things were done, this time crunch could have been overcome. But at the end of the day, all of these messaging issues may not have even been present if the Democrats had run a proper primary. And whether or not Harris was the candidate at the end of that, you would have had someone that had galvanized the support not only of the Democratic base, but potentially a wider swath of the electorate who had been tuned in from last year when a primary would have commenced. I cannot believe I had forgot that, but that is just so absolutely crucial. And apparently his campaign, Biden's campaign, had internal polling that showed Donald Trump in a mock election that Donald Trump had been able to secure 400 electoral votes against Biden. So while I'm thankful that he was bullied out of his candidacy, it just begs the question, what was O'Malley Dillon doing? What was Joe Biden doing? What was Jill Biden doing? Because at the end of the day, his legacy is besmirched because, like most people who inherit power, for some reason, they can't give it up. And that's why God bless George Washington for actually starting the whole premise of the two-term presidency. All right. So as I've noted on my Instagram, I didn't intend that episode 1 would be done in two parts, but given how long everything was that you had just seen, I'm going to split it up into two parts. So stay tuned for part 2, where I'll go into broadly some of the things that the Trump camp has been saying and some things that we'll look out for going forward. Thank you, and have a good night.